Class, and welcome to the second video in our unit of Chemistry of Life. So we're still thinking about the big idea 2, which was remember about how living systems require energy and matter in order to grow and reproduce and maintain their homeostasis. So we're still keeping that in the back of our mind for sure, but now we're also going to incorporate big idea 4, which is the idea that biological systems interact and that these interactions possess complex properties. This should sound familiar. Remember when the first video we discussed the emergent properties of water, that one water molecule did not have all of those amazing properties like cohesion and adhesion and universal solvent, but together, all of those water molecules interacting, those properties came about. And so the same idea applies to these large macromolecules that we even started to discuss in the first video: carbohydrates, nucleic acids, proteins, and lipids. And so this video is probably going to be split into 2 videos because there's a lot of content here. This is going to require a lot on your part to sort of go through your textbook and your notes, make some flashcards, and do some studying on these 4 macromolecules. So in the first part, we're going to try to get through 2 macromolecules, and in the second part, we'll try to get through the other 2. So enduring understanding, interactions within biological systems lead to these complex emergent properties. And so another way to think of emergent properties is to think the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So those little nerve cells don't have memories and thoughts, but the whole of our brain and our being do. Now we're going to apply this at the molecular level of macromolecules. So, a carbon atom or a nitrogen atom or even a carbon and nitrogen bonded together, those don't really have special properties. But when we combine all these different atoms together and we get a carbohydrate or a lipid, we do start to have some really unique, amazing properties come about. So that's what we're going to look at in this video. So for example, cellulose. This is a carbohydrate. And the way that it's bonded and the way that it's shaped has some unique properties that no other carbohydrate does. And then later in the year, we're going to apply this idea of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts to cells. So we're going to learn about all the subcellular organelles and how they interact and how those interactions lead to the function of a cell and then a tissue and an organ and so on. So we're going to see how all of these things are connected and interact together, right? Big idea 4. Biological systems interact. So we're first going to look at the subcomponents because when we think of a macromolecule, it's a big molecule, right? But it's made of little tiny things. And we call these subcomponents our monomers. So we got to look at the monomers, and their sequence is important, and that is going to determine the property of that overall molecule. And hopefully you remember some of this from biology your freshman or sophomore year. So a polymer is simply another name for macromolecule. It's just a large molecule. And so the subcomponents we call monomers. So it's just a single building block. And I like to think of it in terms of Legos or Lincoln Logs. Those are what I played with when I was a little kid. So one little tiny Lego would be considered a monomer. And then when you build all those together and you make your Lego police station, that police station would be the polymer or the macromolecule. Okay, so many building blocks put together make up a polymer. And how do they come about? Well, the reaction that joins monomers together is called a dehydration reaction. So dehydrate simply means to remove water, and during this reaction, a water is removed. So what we have here is we have 2 monomers, 2 amino acids, 1 and 2. And we notice that on either end, we have an OH and an H. And so when they join together, those 3 atoms, oxygen and 2 hydrogens, are going to be removed. So we have a removal of a water there. And now we have the formation of a new bond, which is right here. So this is now our protein polymer that's made up of 2 amino acid monomers through a dehydration reaction. Okay, now that we have a polymer, how do we break it apart? Well, that happens through the process of hydrolysis. Hydro means water, lysis means to break apart. So it's sort of the opposite. We're adding water in order to break apart this polymer. So let's take a look at this. Here's our carbohydrate polymer, and we're going to add water in here along with an enzyme in order to break this apart, in order to break this bond right here. And so when we break that bond, we also have to incorporate those 2 hydrogens and then oxygen. And so that's where those 3 atoms go. So dehydration synthesis, bringing together. Hydrolysis is breaking apart. So let's try to make some connections as we go through here to video 1 and to future concept. So individual monomers are built in living systems through the uptake of nutrients from the environment. So they take this in from the air or from the soil or through food. They're taking in these atoms and they're building the individual monomers, okay? Then these individual monomers need to come together through dehydration reactions to form specific polymers. And then these polymers, once you consume the polymers, for example, your body's going to break them apart again in order to recycle them or to get the energy. The energy is stored in the bonds of the food that you eat. And so your body uses hydrolysis to break those polymers apart. So everything is connected, everything is related. So we're going to start with the first macromolecule of carbohydrates. All carbohydrates are composed of the atoms carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in always a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. The monomer of carbohydrates is called a monosaccharide. This is simply a simple sugar, and some very common examples of simple sugars are glucose, fructose, galactose. Notice that OSE ending. Whenever you see a molecule with the OSE ending, you know that that is a carbohydrate or a simple sugar. So here's an example of that. We often depict simple sugars in the form of a ring. And so I believe this here is glucose. So this is a this is a 6 carbon carbohydrate. So the polymer, we call them polysaccharides, and we're going to look at 4: starch, cellulose, glycogen, and chitin. And hopefully, like I said, you're remembering some of these things from your freshman or sophomore year. So these polymers are all made up of glucose monomers. So that sort of makes these guys special. All just repeating units of glucose. So monomers are monosaccharides. They're carbon rings. And when they combined, this bond here is called a glycosidic bond. And so many of these then are going to form the polymers. The nature of this bonding is going to determine the secondary structure, which then therefore determines the function. Structure and function is a huge theme of biology, and we're always going to come back to that. So let's take a look at an example of how the nature of this bonding determines the function. So starch is the first macromolecule. Starch, the function is energy storage in plants. So when you eat a potato, that potato is full of starch, right? Because that potato, that plant, has been using that macromolecule to store its energy. And so you are consuming that. And let's look at an example. Notice the bonding orientation here. All of the O's are coming down, okay? So just remember that. That is going to be a little bit different than cellulose. So cellulose is not used for energy storage. It's used for structural support. So when you bite into a celery stalk and you get that string, those are strings of cellulose. Animals cannot digest this. So that would be considered roughage in our diet. It passes right through us because we can't digest it. But cows, for example, cows have special bacteria in their stomachs that do that digestion for them. So that's why cows and herbivores are able to get energy from cellulose. We can't break that bond, so we can't get energy from cellulose. So let's take a look at that bond. This bond's a little different. One oxygen goes up and the other oxygen goes down. So it's a little bit of a different orientation than starch. And it's this little tiny change that makes their function different. Very, very cool. And the last carbohydrate, this is the cellulose secondary structure, and they've got hydrogen bonds in there, okay? So we've got repeating units of cellulose, and that's also in your book. Last carbohydrate is glycogen, and so glycogen, the function is energy storage in animals. So this is what we use to store our energy in our muscles, for example. It's a highly branched polymer of glucose monomers. So let's look at this part here. All of these little yellow balls are glucose monomers. And so we can see all of this high branching, lots of bonds happening there. And what's the deal with those bonds? Well, that's where the energy is stored. So our bodies take all of these glucoses, they put them together, and that's how we store our energy. And then when we need to use the energy, we simply break those bonds and take those glucose molecules and get the energy from them. And so we'll learn more about that later on in the year. So structure fits function. I told you that was a huge theme. Simple sugars don't have bonds, right? That's just a simple ring. So this would be how we get quick energy, because we don't have to break a lot of bonds in order to get the energy. So fewer bonds, quicker energy release. And so these are things that are in sugary fruits, for example. Orange is a great place to get your simple sugars, your glucose, your quick energy. Polysaccharides, we've got long-term energy storage here because there are lots of bonds. So more bonds equals more energy stored. So that's why the night before you run a marathon, you want to eat a lot of pasta, get a lot of starch, a lot of polysaccharides, because that's where you're going to have long-term energy storage in all of those bonds. Okay, so let's connect to, say, ourselves or even plants. Humans are plants. How do living systems obtain these needed carbohydrates? We need carbohydrates for energy. Plants also need them for structural support. Well, plants make these carbohydrates for themselves, and they make them through the process of photosynthesis. But where do they get those necessary atoms, right? Don't they need carbon and hydrogen and oxygen? Where do they get those from? Well, the answer is they get the carbon and the oxygen from the air, from carbon dioxide, and they get the water from the soil. So, and obviously they get the energy from the sun. So I'm just trying to get you to constantly think about how living systems get things from their environment and then incorporate it into their bodies, if you will. Okay, what about animals? We get all of these nutrients from eating. So we actually eat our carbohydrates, and then our body uses enzymes and hydrolysis to break those apart and then build them back up. So for energy storage, we would store that in our muscles in the form of glycogen. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I don't have enough time to get into nucleic acids, so we'll do the next 3 in the next video. And you'll notice I don't have any questions prepared for you, simply because I would rather you spend the time reading your book, making flashcards, studying your notes about these macromolecules, so that you can really have all of these structures and functions down pat.